back to my channel. I really want to stay up with this consistency of posting a video every Friday. Today's video is a bit different. Last week's was a makeup look. Today's video is actually about my doll collection. What I'm doing instead is something very different, but first I want to talk about what I am wearing. Today's look is inspired by John Galliano. I don't know much about the history about this particular runway show, but I absolutely adore it. What really stuck out to me was, of course, the 1920s aesthetic. It's very dark, very artistic, kind of messy if you look at the hair and the makeup. The clothing itself is beautiful, of course, but the makeup is very iconic. It's very pale, kind of like clownish white face with very almost painted like looking eyeshadow, very thin, almost squiggly eyebrows, dark lips, colorful cheeks, lots of black and emerald and gold and maroon. A bit of history on my personal love for dolls. I haven't been collecting my whole life. That wasn't really a part of my childhood. We didn't really have a lot of money. I did get, a Barbie every once in a while from my grandma, Christmas or something like that, but I wasn't really able to indulge in my obsession. What I do remember about seeing Barbie dolls at Toys R Us, toy stores, was the really expensive ones that were behind a wall of glass or plastic or whatever it was. The ones that were really beautiful, the Bob Mackies with the beautiful costumes, ones that, were expensive at the time. I mean, compared to how much, a silk stone Barbie is now, it was probably considered not as expensive. But I just remember loving them so much and just loving dolls in general and figurines. So when I got older and I was able to indulge in this, I did heavily. I started collecting dolls in my 20s, and the dolls that I collected at first are very different than the dolls that I collect now. When I first started collecting dolls, my style had changed a little bit. I had gone from kind of like this very dark goth look to a very kitschy aesthetic, and I think my doll collection reflected that. My style kind of reverted back to a darker aesthetic, and those dolls just didn't speak to me anymore, so I did end up selling them. I was able to start my collection over. So my dog has joined me. This is Romeo. Say hi. Hi. As I was saying, eventually my style, my aesthetic changed, and so did my doll collection. I ended up collecting mostly Victorian and early 1900 dolls and figurines, and that is where I'm at. I've been collecting that for a couple years now, and I actually didn't realize how large my collection had gotten until about 2 weeks ago when I purchased this cabinet behind me, and I put most of my dolls in it. The smaller ones, the figurines, boudoir dolls on the bottom, when I realized that, hey, you know what, my collection's not as tiny as I thought it was. And I also realized that a lot of my collection is very breakable. We're talking china dolls and porcelain and things of that nature. I love them, and sometimes they do break. My cats have broken some. Sometimes they fall off my dresser and break, and it is really sad, and I get very attached to them, and I actually never throw them away. Even if they're broken, I don't tend to fix them, but I don't throw away the pieces. Legs and heads and shoulders and arms and all of that in drawers, and can't seem to let them go. If you're trying to start collecting, I would start with research before you actually go out and purchase dolls. A lot of the dolls that I love are very expensive, and there are alternatives to those styles. For example, I do like Victorian dolls, I do like early 1900 dolls, 1920s dolls. Some of them are very expensive in the hundreds and the thousands, but there's always something less expensive. Maybe it's not as beautiful, but it will be in the same style. So it's good to do your research. Doing your research is really easy. I mean, if you just go on your phone, go on your computer, finding information about dolls, there's websites dedicated to dolls, there's blogs, videos, there's probably YouTube channels. I know I'm subscribed to some doll channels. So doing your research is very important when it comes to doll collecting. Another reason why doing your research is important is so that when you are out looking for dolls, you know what you're buying, and a good way to know that is by the materials that the doll is made of, both her body and her clothing. More modern dolls tend to be made a little bit or a lot cheaper. Dolls in the Victorian era and 100 years ago, there were dolls for women, women to adorn their beds, their couches, their sitting areas. So the dolls were beautiful and delicate, and their clothing was made to match that of, a fashionable woman of the time. More modern dolls are made out of mostly plastic. Older dolls tend to be made of specific materials, is probably because certain materials just didn't exist yet. So it's also good to know about your materials that dolls are made out of. Modern dolls, the fashion will also reflect modern times, and older dolls will reflect the fashion of the time, as well as the material that the doll clothes is made out of. Newer dolls are made out of, or their clothing is made out of polyester mostly, and if you look at older dolls, they're made out of silk and lace and actual fabric that a human would probably wear. A lot of 80s dolls were made to mimic early 1900s dolls. The biggest thing would be makeup. The makeup on a doll is very important because that will also date it. An authentic China head doll, her makeup is very specific to her time period. And even more specific, China head dolls also vary in the exact decade that they were created. If you look at her style of hair and face, you'll be able to date it to the exact decade that it came out of. In the 70s, the Victorian aesthetic made a comeback in a lot of different ways, in clothing, in dolls, and home decor. And so China head dolls did come back into fashion at that time, but you can see the difference. I do love 80s porcelain dolls though. Sometimes I will see them at the thrift store and I want to buy them because their clothes is just so precious. The 80s also had a huge Victorian influence, so some of the dolls do reflect that. There are some companies that might be a little bit more expensive, but they did a pretty good job in the reproduction of sort of like a jumeau doll or a Bru doll. And the face isn't exact, it's not perfect, but if you're just starting a collection or you're not really particular about an era of a doll and you just kind of like the style, that's a good place to start. Now, where would we be with dolls if doll houses didn't exist as well? I love doll houses, and when I was a little girl, that is all that I wanted. They're extremely hard to find already built, probably even more so with furniture and wallpaper and flooring and all of that. Doll houses is also one of those things that it's just as expensive, if not more, than a doll. If you look at a real authentic doll house from the 1800s or around that time period, they're going to cost a lot, probably in the thousands. Doll furniture for a doll house is so expensive. If you look on eBay for even used doll furniture, it just, one tiny piece of doll furniture can cost you $40, $50. Dolls come in all kinds of different sizes. You can get tiny dolls, medium dolls, larger dolls. There is actual furniture in the size for different kinds of dolls. Just like an American Girl doll has, her house, her car, her furniture, her clothes. There's also doll furniture on a larger scale for vintage dolls. The most important thing in doll collecting is probably storing your dolls and ensuring that they don't get damaged. When I started collecting dolls, I didn't have a lot of space. So now that I live in a house and I have, multiple rooms to put dolls in, to me it was so important to put them behind glass. So most of my dolls are now behind glass. Storing your dolls is so important. So if you are planning on buying expensive dolls or delicate dolls or old dolls, it's so important to invest in a cabinet or in boxes. If it's much better to keep them in containers versus their paper, cardboard packaging, because that can also get damaged. So you've done your research, you know the style, and you're ready to go buy dolls, but you don't really know where to go. There's a lot of different places to buy dolls, and a lot of people know what they're selling. So if you want something extremely specific, you might be paying hundreds or even thousands. Depends how much you really want it. One of the best places to go to is local flea markets. There's a local flea market that is mostly antique sellers, and that is where I get a lot of my dolls. Antique shops are an obvious place to go for dolls. People selling in antique shops, they know what they're doing. They know how much a doll is worth. You're paying exactly what the doll is worth, and you're not really going to get a great deal on it. There's been a rare moment where I have gone to a garage sale and found a doll that did not belong there because she belonged with me. One time I went to a garage sale and there was this beautiful doll there, and she was being sold for $1. She looks like she's from the 80s. She still plays music and she's so lovely, and I couldn't believe that they were getting rid of her. So sometimes you'll find yourself lucky like that. An obvious route is Etsy and eBay. I will search for more broad things versus an actual doll name. For example, old doll or spooky doll. Sometimes people will list antique dolls that way, or vintage doll. You have to skim through a lot, but eventually you'll find something good. And my final tip for buying dolls is estate sales. I searched for them. I would go multiple times a week to whatever estate sale I could find. If I got lucky, which kind of was a lot, I would find a beautiful doll to bring home with me. So now that I've told you about collecting dolls, I want to show you some of my dolls. Here is a larger doll. She's a bit dusty because I did have her out and I just barely put her behind glass. She's a Charles A. Berry doll, and her name is Eliza Essex. I actually found photos of her online, fell in love with this collection, and it was something that I wanted so bad, but they were a little bit too pricey for me. One day my husband came home. He had been thrift shopping with a friend, and he had this doll, and I couldn't believe it. He just found it sitting at a thrift store, and it was something that I wanted so bad, and he found it, and that's how I got her. This one isn't really a doll. She is a figurine and she's part of a set, but they are very delicate, so I didn't want to take both of them out. And as you can see, her dress is already ripping. She is from the 1920s, and it is an absolutely stunning pair. Somebody was selling the set and I jumped on the opportunity to buy them. And last but not least is this little doll, and if you follow me online, you've probably seen her big sister. This is the little version of this three-faced doll. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you learned something new about doll collecting. If you have any questions or any suggestions for my next video, go ahead and leave a comment.